part of my duties here at the university, or kind of a side duty that I have, is conducting the Rolla Town Band, and it's part of my kind of my teaching philosophy is of preserving the tradition of the American town band, because we have a rich tradition in that. And so as I started looking at some of the research out there about the beginnings of our own town band here in Rolla, I stumbled across this little gem. And that is the fact that in Rolla, in the late 1800s, we had a musical conservatory, and one that was actually very successful. So my talk today, really, again, a lot of my research has to deal with music education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, kind of turn of the century. There were a lot of different things going on in the wider scope of music, but also in music education at the same time. And so it kind of all came together at the end of the 19th century to create a lot of very interesting stories. A lot of stories are of schools and of colleges and just other musical entities that are no longer in existence. And so I also feel that it's very important to try to do what we can to preserve the history that's out there and try to tell the stories and even dig up the stories again, even if they have been told, but maybe it's been a while, and sometimes you can even find some new information on some of these things. So the talk that I have today is also going to give you a little bit of background information about what music education was like in early days of America, going towards the turn of the century, which will hopefully put a little more context into the specific conservatory that ran here in Rolla, the Western Conservatory of Music. So really quick, just going through a little bit of basic history of music in early America. Our sense of music education in colonial, or really starts in the colonial days with the Pilgrim and Puritan traditions. Those traditions obviously stressed religious music, specifically hymns. These early traditions, the Puritan tradition, was much more of a very simple, not harmonized, unaccompanied congregational style of singing. And Pilgrims and Puritans, when they came to what is now New England, they brought that tradition with them. And in fact, just an interesting kind of side note, the first book ever published in what is now the United States of America was actually published, was a song book, was a psalm book, I should say, from 1640, the base psalm book, which was originally a Dutch music book. In the colonies, you really didn't have the means to produce a music book like a modern day hymnal like we have today with actual music notation. It was literally just what we call a psalter, which is just tunes that were, or that were not tunes, that were just poetry, basically, just metrical poetry. And you could take those different metered poems, obviously on a religious text, and set them to whatever tunes were familiar to your time and your place. So that was the first book that we ever published here in America, was a hymnal. As the colonies developed, we start to see distinct musical traditions, and therefore music education traditions start to develop. In New England, again, it's really based off of vocal music that was used mainly to aid worship. You really didn't learn music to become a professional musician or to really perform. It was really whatever could pass the tunes that would aid in your worship. Very little instrumental music was done, at least taught in New England in the early colonial days. That's again kind of part of that religious tradition, the Calvinist view of music in religion, is basically that only vocal music is really allowed, unaccompanied, not necessarily even harmonized music. It's pretty generic. And there was also a belief in the New England colonies of more of a wider universal public education, that everybody had the necessity to learn, and that was in all manner of disciplines. In the southern colonies, though, they focused more on secular and a lot more instrumental music down south. You would see artists in America or even in Europe touring in the South. Some of the more, as we would call it, kind of classical music, the the more sophisticated culture, tradition, so to say, was being brought up in the South. And that drew a lot more of the artists to the South, and also drew a lot more teachers that kind of fed the demand for really the people in the upper class to participate in a rich musical life. So it was really just meant for, it wasn't education for everybody. It was education for the wealthy landowners who were involved in a lot of different disciplines in their upbringing. Throughout the 18th century, the quality of music in New England churches started to decline. And so there was a concerted effort to bring about better singing in the church. And so you started having what were called singing schools pop up all over New England. And these singing schools were taught by singing school masters. And these were people who had a little more training in music and could teach a basic pedagogy of how to sing hymns in the church. And so these singing schools, what would basically happen is you would have a singing school master travel from town to town, would make contact with people in a town and say, hey, you want to learn how to sing better in your church? And they would put them up for usually about 12 to 16 weeks. And they would have regular classes or regular gatherings to learn how to sing. So you think about a lot of these places in New England, they're still very agricultural. You have like town centers, but most people lived out on farms away from the town centers. And so they'd really only come to town for special events, like on Sunday for church or for other town gatherings. And so these singing school gatherings became more social events too, because it was something you would do in the middle of the week. Everybody would come together and learn how to sing. It would take hours. They would, have food and camaraderie. And so it was another kind of social event that occurred. Through these singing schools, we start to see new systems of teaching music using different styles of notation. This is where the shape note tradition, if you know anything about the sacred harp tradition, primitive Baptist tradition of singing, it's basically where instead of learning traditional musical theory, like how to build a scale, it's really all built off of 4 notes. And you can see there at the bottom of the slide here, how each note of the scale was a different shape, or each syllable, solfege syllable as we call them. And so by building up those 4 notes in a sequence, you can learn how to sing a scale. You can learn how to sing a melody or even harmony just because you learned how to read those shape notes. And the people found that it was easier to do that than to teach traditional music theory, especially to people who weren't really musicians. One of the after effects of the singing schools was that after the singing master would leave, a lot of times people would continue to meet and sing, and you would have these permanent singing societies and later musical societies created long after the singing master had moved on. And especially in some of the bigger cities in New England, these societies, these singing societies, would start to venture into more sophisticated music, more of the classical music as we'd call it. So one of the big ones in Boston was the Handel and Haydn Society. Also with Boston, they had a big role to play in 19th century, not just music education, but just education in general. 1821 is the first time that we see public education become a widely accepted thing. This is when Boston creates the first American public school system. And then a man named Lowell Mason, who he had served as president of the Handel and Haydn Society for a time, and he also co-founded the Boston Academy of Music in 1833. He helped push for the inclusion of music education into the public schools, which it did, at least on a trial basis, in 1837. Later, Mason would become the music superintendent for the Boston Public Schools up until 1841. And he's also well known as a composer and arranger of over 1,600 hymn tunes. Many of them are still well known, or at least his arrangements are well known. One that's probably more popular is his tune Bethany, which is now associated with the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. As public schools started to become more prevalent in New England, more communities started to follow suit and included music as part of their curriculum as well. Southern states, however, were still they were still largely agricultural, and so private study was still the primary means of learning, period, in the South, but especially with music, and again, really relegated to the most wealthy to really learn how to learn about music in the cultural tradition. As music became a part of more public school systems after the Civil War, special needs started to arise, one of which was a standardized curriculum. And so we start to see a number of general music courses become developed by different publishers. So like the Ginn brothers created the National Music Course. Luther Whiting Mason, another big name in early music education, created the National Music Teacher course, and then the Normal Music course by John Tufts and H.E. Holt. And what's significant about that is it not only gave teachers a curriculum, a standardized curriculum by which to teach from, they also started to create some of the early teacher training for musicians. It began with H.E. Holt. They began to arrange for summer kind of music academies so they could teach their methods to the teachers who would then teach the students. Soon after that, Luther Mason and the Ginn brothers, the Silver Burdett and Ginn Company, did the same thing. They would hold and develop curriculum courses for the music teachers. One of the other things that was happening at the same time as we were starting in America to develop more of a public school system and public education in music, another thing that was happening, not just in America, but in Europe, was that in music, we're starting to see bigger and bigger divides between art music and popular music. So like today, we think about orchestral music versus rock and roll. They're worlds apart in a lot of different ways, at least who consumes them and how popular culture treats them. Throughout music history, we talk about music in kind of style periods. Like what are some of the prevailing trends of musical style throughout each era? And in the early 19th century, in mid 19th century, we're in what we music historians would call the Romantic era. If you study art history, there's some of the same terms pop up, but usually visual art predates the musical arts. We're a little slowed on the uptake with some of our style periods. Right before the 19th century and the 18th century is what we refer to as the classical period. This is about 1750 to around 1815, 1820, depending on the historian you're talking to. And that is the music of Haydn, Mozart, the early music of Beethoven. And this is where we first start seeing this shift, whereas during that era in the 18th century, a lot of the popular tunes of the time were coming from those composers like Haydn and Mozart. By the time we get to the 19th century, that's not the case. The classical music, as we'll call it, I kind of call it the little C classical, as opposed to the classical era, the late 18th century C classical. Classical music starts to be seen as a genre or a type of music that is only for the rich, the sophisticated, the highfalutin, if you will. And so we start to see that divide. So in the 19th century art music, we start to see a lot more instrumental music, especially virtuosic instrumental music. So like artists like Paganini, showing off on the violin and creating a spectacle in their performances. Even in vocal music, it's becoming much more sophisticated than just playing tunes and strophic variations, or strophic forms, of music. And so art music starts to become more for the rich connoisseur and the music critic. That's what and so artists and composers of that time are writing music to get written about and to create an audience and doing new and interesting things with music. Whereas just a few decades before, Mozart and Haydn were writing, yes, very innovative pieces, but they're more formulaic in that era, because everybody was wanting to kind of coalesce along a similar thread of how music was composed and performed. And so in the 19th century, as the art music becomes more sophisticated and really becomes a little more inaccessible to the wider public, we see the emergence of more popular music styles. And this is going to be music for the middle class. And we see a number of ways this happens. One way that we see this happen is within the art music realm, taking like an aria from a popular opera in Europe and kind of reducing it down to just a singer and a piano that you would hear on like early form of kind of a vaudeville kind of show. And so you can experience the high art, but in a more kind of simplistic way, and not as grandiose on a large theater stage. We also start to see the emergence of minstrel songs, which were popular songs that were typically performed by white musicians, but often played on Black stereotypes. We still, we're going to be hitting a lot of that at this period. This is where the blackface performer starts becoming popular. But those songs are still going to become very popular in American culture. And then parlor songs are another realm that we see in popular music towards the middle to the end of the 19th century. And these are simple tunes that could be performed and sung and self-accompanied at home. And this is the sheet music that you could buy from a publisher and take it home and learn how to do it. And even if you didn't have a lot of training in the piano, from a fancy school, you probably learned, much like guitarists today learn from their parents. They kind of pick up the guitar and dad shows you how to play some chords. Same kind of thing. You're learning a lot from your parents, from their family, not necessarily going to school to learn how to play. So these parlor songs would be great ways that people, middle-class people, can enjoy music in the home. And I point out Stephen Foster as kind of the, although he had some minstrel songs as well, some of his other tunes were very popular parlor songs as well. So by the late 19th century, music education started to spread out to meet all of these needs. So in the realm of music teacher training, like we talked about the different courses that the publishers would produce and create summer camps for, we start to see more regular music teacher training. And it really starts with what are called normal schools. Normal schools start to become established in many different states that really they're established to train teachers. And the way I always kind of explain it, and the way it was kind of explained to me is, if you ever gone to a school that has a direction in its name, even if they change its name, like Truman State used to be Northeast Missouri State, if it's a directional school, chances are it was a normal school. It was there to teach area people how to teach. And so because you had those normal schools spread all throughout, like for example, Missouri, you had a lot of different places where local people could go to learn how to be teachers and then take that knowledge to their smaller towns and become teachers. So soon after those normal schools started to become established, music curriculum was not far behind. As far as the training of musicians in the home, one of the things, both art music and popular music, one of the things that became popular, especially at the late part of the 19th century, were female seminaries. And so if you think about it, if music training really wasn't necessarily, if you're just an amateur musician, wasn't really necessarily meant for men. Men were usually going to school, they were becoming businessmen, they were becoming scientists, they were becoming entrepreneurs. But the women were the ones who were taking a lot of these courses in music at these female seminaries. And so a lot of them became established, and many of them were established through different religious organizations, like the Methodists would have a bunch of seminaries. I know there were some here in Missouri. And they gave girls a chance at a higher education. But again, those girls weren't taking necessarily science, math, those kinds of things. They were taking other kinds of coursework. There was a philosophy of the time where that stated that basically women couldn't handle some of those bigger subjects. So we're still going to teach them how to run a home, how to manage the household, how to rear children. And so music became part of that as well, because music was seen as a tool. Especially if you were a young woman who came from kind of a lower social status, if you were able to make it to college and learn these skills, then especially learning how to play an instrument, then it would be a little bit easier for you to find a rich husband that you could help entertain. That was part of your job. You helped entertain the guests, the business associates, and that was one of your contributions to the household. So that's where we start seeing music in the home. We even see training for those kinds of I would say careers, but yeah, I mean, that's those kinds of those lifestyles. And then as far as art music training is concerned, we do start to see in the mid to late 19th century an expansion of the kind of the European model of conservatories. And so European conservatory models had started popping up in the 17th century, in Paris. and in Berlin and in other places in Europe. And they were training the professional musicians, the ones who were going to play in the professional orchestras. And we started to adapt that here in America. Once we started to create our own orchestras, especially orchestras here in America, we started to create our own conservatories to train those musicians. A lot of our earliest orchestras were really actually made up of a lot of German and Austrian citizens who moved to America to become musicians here. So eventually we start to train our own musicians as well. And so we start to see these conservatories pop up. So some of them that I've noted here, and there's many, many more, such as the Peabody Institute, which is now part of Johns Hopkins University, was established in 1857 in Baltimore. The Oberlin College in 1865, the New England Conservatory in 1867, Boston, and the National Conservatory of Music in New York in 1885. But we'll also see that music is going to start permeating through other schools as well. The normal schools and even more sophisticated musical training will be happening even in public universities as we get into the 20th century. So how does that kind of fit in with what we do here and what Missouri S&T now is and what began as the Missouri School of Mines? So in 1862 is when the Morrill Land Grant Act was passed, and it gave federal lands to the states to help support either putting universities or colleges on the land or selling the land and using the proceeds. It gave those states freedom to establish new colleges to specifically gear towards agriculture and the mechanical arts. And so that's where some of the funding for the University of Missouri came up, and some of the other land grant institutions we have here in Missouri. Missouri was given 330,000 acres. It was all based on your representation in Congress. Columbia, of course, was chosen to support the agriculture college, which it still is there. And then there was a decision to support a separate school somewhere in the iron district of the state, which we're kind of on the edge of. But in 1870, the Board of Curators was created and appointed, but there was not a location yet decided. It wasn't until 1871 that the first session of the School of Mines actually opens. What basically happens is there becomes a little bidding war between Phelps County and Iron County of who's going to house this new school of what would be the School of Mines. And the folks of Phelps County found out how much Iron County was going to bid, and they outbid it. So they got the school. So the first actual session of the School of Mines is opened in 1871. It's advertised as a 3-year course of study in engineering, mechanics, geology, mineralogy, chemistry, assaying, and physics. There are also optional courses offered in languages such as German and French. And then there was, as part of a provision of the Morrill Act, there also had to be a required and some kind of training in military tactics. And that's kind of where this next gentleman comes into play. Robert W. Dothat, who went by the name Dr. Dothat, although there's been no evidence that he actually earned a doctorate. He had been given a couple of honorary doctorates from places back in Virginia where he was from. He was originally from Virginia. He had joined the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He had risen to the rank of captain, and his claim to fame was that he was the only surviving captain in the now infamous Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. Although I can't independently verify that, my understanding is he kind of talked a lot after he retired, and he went on a lot of speaking tours, and he might have overplayed his acumen there. After the war, he became a farmer and a teacher. And then in 1873, he joined the School of Mines faculty. He was the faculty member in charge of languages and also the head of the preparatory department. In the early couple of years of the School of Mines, there was a noticeable lack of preparation for some of the students. They were missing some basic knowledge. And so that was part of Dothat's charge, was to kind of head up the preparatory school to kind of help catch up people and also go to the community and try to bring up, get students ready to come to the School of Mines. He also served as the secretary of the faculty, which is going to be a very important thing to note in just a second. By 1877, the School of Mines was starting to see some enrollment issues. By that time, the enrollment had dropped to 43, and there was talk about taking away the School of Mines from Rolla, and maybe even giving Rolla the teacher college that Columbia had, and giving the mines and metallurgy up to Columbia. Eventually, that idea was dropped, but Dothat didn't just kind of wait for things to happen. He was really big on recruitment. He spearheaded a lot of efforts to try to increase the enrollment at the School of Mines. He wanted to try to bring in more women students into by adding what was advertised as girls courses in arts, and there was a lot of different curricula changes that he wanted to make to try to incorporate or try to bring in more people to the university. Another thing he would do, he would go on recruiting trips. Not just in Missouri, although he did travel. The Rolla Herald newspaper talked about his exploits all over the state, especially down around the southwest of the state. But he would also travel to the southwest, part of the United States, or what will become the United States. And he would take out trips to Texas, to Mexico, because there was a lot of digging and blowing up of stuff out west, and you needed people who knew how to do that. And so he would go out and try to recruit students, and a lot of Spanish-speaking students as well, to bring them back to Rolla to kind of help with enrollment. And by 1880, the enrollment had increased to 71 students. During this time, Professor Dothat also purchased an old tobacco factory in Rolla, which was located down between 7th and 8th Streets in Rolla, not too far down from the Methodist Church over there. And he turned it into a dormitory, which was known as Poverty Flats. And in Poverty Flats, he housed his children, his 9 children, his wife, and many of those Spanish-speaking students that he brought back to Rolla. And there's stories that his daughter retells about them sitting at the breakfast table every morning. He would teach English to the Spanish-speaking students. Dothat also developed an idea of forming a musical conservatory in the nearby Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church that's right over there. The idea kind of came to them after a concert that he had attended earlier in the year with another member of the School of Mines faculty, George Emerson. And again, it was his hope that he could increase the profile of the School of Mines, and again, try to recruit more women. And so you can see here, this is why being the secretary of the faculty is very important, because you're the one who gets to write the advertisements. And in the advertisements, it's very hard to see on this slide, and I apologize, but at the very bottom, it talks about about the girls' courses in arts, and about a new conservatory in which students can take classes. And from my understanding, that caught the science faculty a little bit by surprise, because it started a little bit of a controversy we'll talk about. Dothat printed advertisements for the conservatory and sent them out to over 3,500 papers, both in English and in Spanish, all across the country, especially out west, in the hopes of getting more students. And he did this at his own expense. And then they were able to garner enough support, especially from people in the Rolla area. The early day of the conservatory didn't see a lot of people from outside of the immediate Rolla area, but just with what was around, was able to officially open the conservatory after a couple of small delays on September 29th, 1882. And at first it was just called Musical Conservatory. Within that first year, the name Western Conservatory of Music was coined, and it became the Western Conservatory of Music. The picture you see here is actually from 1883, where they had moved. The original, the first year of the conservatory classes were held in the Methodist Church. They were able to use some of the rooms in the Methodist Church. Later, they got a building called the Gottleman Building, and it's down on 6th and 6th and Main. Yeah, it's down on 6th and Main. It's no longer there. It's for those of you in Rolla, it's where the Family Video used to be. It's over in that area. So it's the building's long gone, and any remnants are long gone. You can see there, it opened up with 40 students and 4 faculty members. You can see largely based off of vocal training, piano and organ training, and then the other instrumental music was really relegated to guitar, violin, and cello. And this is a quote from Dothat that was from the Rolla Herald from September 28, 1882. The Western Conservatory of Music is destined to be the most important institution west of the Mississippi, and we predict for it a fame as wide as that of the New England Conservatory. So you can see that his hopes, his aspirations were making it like the New England Conservatory, which already had, was already building that reputation as one of the finest institutions of learning professional music in the country. His hopes was that it was going to be that big, that grand. But again, controversy kind of strikes up. The opening created a controversy between Dothat and the science faculty at the School of Mines. They were primarily opposed to the expansion of the curriculum beyond, I think some of them kind of felt that they were overstepping their bounds, their strict letter of why they were created. They're leaving the idea of doing just mines and metallurgy and the mechanical arts. So they thought that they were kind of overstepping things. And they were also kind of disturbed by the amount of time that Dothat was taking in putting all this together. Even though the original faculty had a director, Dothat was still spending an inordinate amount of time, as the science faculty would say, doing work for the conservatory. And so the article clippings I have here, and I apologize, the PowerPoint kind of stretched it all down. One is the smaller one there is an announcement from the Rolla Herald in 1882, basically disavowing the conservatory and saying it's not part of the School of Mines. You can take classes there, but it's not a part of the school. They were very adamant to believe the science faculty were the ones who published that in the Herald, saying this is not us. Later in the spring of 1882, or 83, I'm sorry, Dothat had published in the Herald the announcement of a summer school that they would be offering in the conservatory, and that was quickly shut down by the rest of the School of Mines faculty. And so that article on the right-hand side, that clipping, is from April of 1883, in which Dothat says, nope, we're not going to do a summer school this year. And this kind of starts a fight, really, between Dothat and the science faculty, which is not saying I have fights with science faculty here, but I can appreciate being a music faculty at an engineering school. I can appreciate that, you wanted to have the things that you need to do the things. So Dothat realized really quick that if he wanted this conservatory to survive, someone else had to come in and really take it over. And so the man he got to do this is a man named Ephraim Homer Scott, or he just referred to himself as E.H. Scott. For some reason the visual is kind of messed up on this one, I apologize. In 1870, a man named James H. Scott, who was a Methodist preacher, he was also a piano tuner and kind of a amateur, pseudo-professional reed organ builder, moved his family from Illinois to Rolla. He had kind of become ill. His health wasn't always the best. And so even though he was trained as a minister and he worked for the Methodist Church, he decided to kind of semi-retire, move to Rolla, become a farmer. And he owned an orchard kind of down by the downtown area of Rolla that stands now. He picked a really bad spot, I think, because he would keep writing articles to the Herald complaining about the trains going by and the smoke was destroying his crops. To which every time I read it, I was thinking, why did you plant your orchard near trains? But that's neither here nor there. So he became a farmer. His eldest son, Homer, I'll refer to him as Homer, Ephraim, kind of both. He actually attended the School of Mines in 1873 to 75, but he didn't graduate. Around that time, he also began teaching music lessons. So again, it's kind of presumed that his father had taught him, and he had kind of self-taught himself a little bit too. And so he started giving music lessons around town around 1873. And then eventually did take formal lessons, formal training from the Beethoven Conservatory of Music in St. Louis, which he graduated from in 1876. As soon as he graduated from Beethoven, came right back to Rolla, kind of picked up the same kind of thing of teaching lessons and kind of being a musical fixture in Rolla. In 1879, James, the father, moved the family back to Illinois, to a town called Abington, where he wanted to try to find more educational opportunities for his younger children, besides Ephraim, who is now in his late teens, early 20s. He also had his daughter, Luella, who was 15 at the time, and his youngest son, John, who was 9. In 1880, Homer followed the family back to Abington and established a conservatory and heading college in Abington. College no longer exists, but found a little bit of information about the start of that. And it appears that Homer Scott actually started that conservatory at Heading, based on apparently what the needs of the college at the time. Later on in 1883, Dofat decides to contact Homer Scott and convinces him to come back to Rolla and to take over the running of the Western Conservatory. Dofat stayed on as manager for at least a little bit of time. The rest of the Scott family would return back to Rolla in 1884. The father then James became part of the conservatory. He taught piano tuning and gave lectures on how to tune the piano and tuned the actual pianos all throughout the conservatory. And so there's articles in the Herald that talk about, Mr. Scott is back tuning the pianos, and you'll hear them all throughout the hallway. Students of the conservatory eventually included Luella and John, who helped start the conservatory band. There had been bands, brass bands in Rolla as early as the 1870s, the earliest I was able to find, an actual organized group. And they kind of were off and on throughout the 1870s, early 1880s. In 1882, the Rolla Cornet Band, as it was called, was kind of housed at 83, was kind of housed at the conservatory. And I think it kind of meshed in with some of the conservatory students. And so it basically became the conservatory band from that point. And so this picture here is actually an interesting one. It shows seated there on the left side, that is John W. Scott, that is the younger brother of Homer. In the middle is Edwin Bishop Jr., and if that name sounds familiar, it's because it's the son of the town founder of Rolla, Edwin Bishop Sr. Tragically, Edwin Bishop died just a couple years after this photo was taken. And then Roy Phillips, another member of the conservatory band, is there on the right side. John Scott, I'll talk a little bit about because he has another history, which is a whole other talk, but we will touch on him just a little bit. As soon as Homer Scott took over the conservatory, it rapidly began to grow. And so he started to create a curriculum just like he had been taught at Beethoven. So he's basically taking the musical training he had and the pedagogy they had taught him at Beethoven, and now he's transferring it on to Western Conservatory in Rolla. So the curriculum was centered around private instruction. There were regular recitals performed by students and by faculty. They also included a community singing class. They were trying to get community members involved as much as they could into the conservatory, so it wasn't just seen as like this outside entity. It wanted to include as much of the community as possible. There were also always new instruments being purchased. There were recitals and performances that were done to help raise money for instruments. There were also eventually Homer had made arrangements with the Beethoven Conservatory that students that completed their coursework at the Western Conservatory could transfer right into higher study at Beethoven. So he was able to use his connections with that school as well. Dofat, for his sake, he stayed at the School of Mines for just another year, but he was forced to relinquish all control of the conservatory. In the summer of '84, he advertised in the paper that he was selling his share of the conservatory, and he swore to devote more time to the School of Mines. But really the damage had already been done. He really had kind of soured his relations with the science faculty. And so in December of 1884, he left the School of Mines and took a new job in New Mexico. The rest of the family, the Dothats, would stay here for another few months, and the following summer, the rest of them would move out as well. although the Dolphins would still have a connection to Rolla and to the musical culture in Rolla. John Scott, as he develops some of the musical traditions that we had here in Rolla in the early 20th century, we're still good friends with the Dolphins, and so there was still this connection. By 1883, the Western Conservatory had boasted 47 students, and they were taking up to 400 lessons per month in all different manners of instruments. In 1884, there were 100 students reported. And this just kind of continued to develop over the next couple of years, where the conservatory would be bringing in people from mainly, again, mostly in Missouri, but then you started to see more and more students coming from like Southwest Missouri or into Oklahoma or Nebraska. You start to see more students coming in from out of state coming to the conservatory. A side note, in 1886, Ephraim Scott married a woman named Annie M. Lee, whose father was also a Methodist minister. And she had actually just graduated from the conservatory, so he was quite a bit older than she was. In 1888, because of the success of the conservatory and the fact that he was getting so many students from places more further south and west, he decided to actually move the conservatory out of Rolla and moved it to Carthage, which kind of made sense because it was kind of a crossroads, if you will, for the railroad coming out through Springfield, from St. Louis to Springfield, but also the crossroads to Kansas City as well. So it was a good kind of central location. And since, again, he was getting all of these students from that area, it just made more sense to do that. So in 1888, he kind of closed up shop here in Rolla. I think there were some little slight vestiges of the conservatory still kind of around, but both he and John left to go start up the conservatory in Carthage. They also opened and operated Scott Brothers Music and Stationery, which is going to be another theme of John Scott's life, having a side business dealing with musical. With music and stationery and those kinds of things. The venture out to Carthage only lasted 1 year. In 1889, Scott moved the conservatory to Kansas City on the old YMCA building on the corner of 9th and Locust Streets, which again is a building that no longer exists. In part of my research of this conservatory, one of the trickiest things is that I came across 4 different Western conservatories of music, or conservatory, or some variation of the name Western Conservatory. So doing a search was hectic because you had to figure out, well, what is the actual Western Conservatory? One Western Conservatory of Music had the exact same name, was in Kansas City at this time. And I haven't found the evidence yet, but my assumption is, because the evidence that I found was that at this time in 1889, that conservatory in Kansas City had a couple of branch locations. I think Warrensburg had a location. There may have been another one north of Kansas City. But what I was discovering was it seemed like that Kansas City location was starting to go under. They were kind of struggling. And so it would not be out of the realm of possibility if Homer Scott saw this and he already had a conservatory called the Western Conservatory, and here's this one already called Western Conservatory in Kansas City. He just moved into that building. And actually both the Western Conservatory that previously ran in Kansas City and his were both located in the YMCA building. So I'm making an assumption here, but I don't feel it's too far-fetched to believe that he basically just bought that space and took over that Western Conservatory. John, his younger brother, who by this time was 19, he returned to Rolla. He actually did attend School of Mines as well. He was considered an alum of the School of Mines, even though he didn't graduate. And he became a pharmacist. In 1890, he started to apprentice a local pharmacist, because back in the day, you didn't go to pharmacy school, you just apprenticed with a pharmacist and you learned the trade. And so he apprenticed with a pharmacist and eventually got his license. And eventually he took over the drugstore that he worked at, which he renamed. It used to be called Luby's Drugs. But he renamed it to Scott's Drugs, and it was on the corner of 8th and Pine Street, which, if you're from Rolla or you're in Rolla, it's where the Hoppers Pub is now. That is where Scott's Drugs used to be. And at that time, 8th and Pine was the place to be. There was the Grand House, which is a hotel, had a theater. That's where some of the early musical performances were done. Some of the John Scott's bands that he produced, that he created, performed there throughout the late 19th, early 20th century. So John Scott became a very valued member of the community. He was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He was president of the school board for a couple of years, served other positions on the school board as well. He was a big promoter of education in Rolla. He also directed just about any ensemble that was going on at the time. He directed music at the high school. He directed the first, the really first truly organized band and orchestra here in Rolla, the Rolla Town Band. The archives here in Rolla has amazing files with his ledgers of, you can see exactly how he worked the band and how many people joined, and the people who did join, what you could tell these were people that were high up in society, in Rolla society. And so basically, until John Scott died in 1950, he was basically music in Rolla, top to bottom. But again, not just that, he sold music and musical instruments and music out of his store. He sold stationery. He sold textbooks to MSN students. His wife, Stella, would help take care of students. There was no nurse. There's no medical center here. So if they got sick, they had all the medicines down at the drugstore, and Stella would help students. They were known to be very generous with their time and their money. If students couldn't pay, they were very willing to help them out. So they became strong fixtures in the Rolla community. Again, I can go into a whole 2-hour talk just on John Scott, and probably next year I will. So back to Homer. With his move to Kansas City in 1889, 1890, he continued that success. He just broadened it out more and became, again, so successful, he had to upgrade once more. And so in 1900, he moved the conservatory to Chicago, in Kimball Hall in Chicago. And he continued to expand the conservatory's offerings over the next 25 years. And this is building right here. This is a picture of Kimball Hall. It's on the corner of Wabash and Jackson Boulevard in Chicago. Today, it's known as the Lewis Center, which is the law school for DePaul University. And so that's one of the trips I need to make, is go check out although I've been told they don't really have a lot of records of that time. DePaul, I think, bought it in like 1930, so they don't really have much of the previous ownership. One of the mysteries, and I know Katie can attest to this because she's helped me with this, and Carol used to help me with this, is I did discover that in 1909, Homer Scott remarried. He married a woman named Grace Knowlton from Iowa. I don't know what happened to Annie. I don't. The last I have census from 1900 saying that they were living in Kansas City. By 1909, he marries Grace. My presumption is that she passed away at some point, but I have no record of that right now. So if anybody ever sees anything about Annie Scott, I'd love to hear what happened to her. As he develops the conservatory in Kansas City and later Chicago, he develops his own system in music instruction. He referred to it as the interstate system of music. So sometime around when he was in Carthage and in Kansas City, you start to see evidence of other Western conservatories popping up. And not just, there was one Western conservatory in Emporia, Kansas, but that was started by someone else. Like, it was a completely different venture. But you start seeing what was referred to as a branch of the Chicago or the Kansas City Western Conservatory of Music. And they keep using the term interstate system of music, or interstate music system. And so basically it worked like this. You are an aspiring music teacher in small town Kansas. I want to be a teacher. I want to be the music teacher in my small town. Well, you would go to Kansas City or Chicago in the later years, and you would learn the system. You would graduate from the conservatory. And so then you would take that knowledge, bring it back to your hometown. Your knowledge would be supplemented with materials that were sent from the conservatory, from Scott. Scott would write his own materials and send out lectures to his former students that are now teachers. And so you would then teach your students that same conservatory system so that when your students finished their course of study, they would also become graduates of the Western Conservatory of Music. So it's almost pseudo correspondence school too, which was, again, early part of the 20th century is more of a thing in education. So you have this mixture of traditional conservatory instruction, private lessons, and those kinds of things, but also mixed with correspondence school, mixed with just kind of a created curriculum. And that's one thing I'm if I can find it, it's my gold mine. If I can find an actual, there are a couple in the archives, in the S&T archives, there's one. There's also one in the Historical Society archives of just like a catalog of the conservatory, one when it was in Rolla, one when it was in Chicago. But if I could find a curriculum, like an actual, like some of those notes from Scott and the lectures that he wrote, then, but that's, a bigger dig that we'll have to just take time to do. So the local branches were then taught by these teachers that would come back from Kansas City or Chicago. They were known as associate teachers. And again, they were trained at the main branch, and then they would go out and implement the same curriculum. The idea, again, is that the local students, or the students at the local branch, would be receiving the same quality of education as if they were in Kansas City or Chicago. The curriculum for the students, it included a diagnostic exam to kind of see where you were before you kind of place you into whatever level that you were in. And again, exams at every level, and you would have a recital every year, sometimes twice a year. Graduation ceremonies from these other branches talk about the graduating class. They do a special musical production or a musicale recital. And so each level you would just obtain a higher and higher level until you graduated. And like I said, the local teachers were then given letters and lectures prepared by Scott himself and some of the other instructors of the school. And they came framed straight from the main office that they would then teach. And even though he was in Chicago, this was still very much a family affair. His wife, Grace, was a member of the faculty. Even John was one of the officers on the board of the conservatory, even though he lived in Rolla. But he and Stella would take trips up to Chicago quite often to visit Ephraim and help him out with the conservatory. By 1895, before he had moved to Chicago, reports showed branches in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the Indian Territory, which would be present-day Oklahoma, Colorado, California, and Texas. This thing was everywhere. In 1917, the Rolla Herald reported that the conservatory had 116 branches with over 6,000 pupils. They even had a branch here in Rolla. It was operated by a couple different people in the early 20th century. But by 1917, Scott's niece, Olive, who was John Scott's daughter, became the director of the Rolla branch here. And then that spawned an entire culture here in Rolla of continued music education even after the conservatory. There was an alumni association of the Western Conservatory called the Utopian Club, which met regularly and gave regular recitals here in Rolla long after the conservatory even shut down. And there are other instances of the remnants of that in music clubs throughout even the mid 20th century. And it wasn't just the Rolla Herald that was reporting some of these instances. I found an article from the Chicago Music News that stated that the interstate music system had stretched, quote, from Massachusetts to California and from Minnesota to Florida. So there's a lot more out there to find and to discover. Like I said, part of what makes it difficult is the fact that a lot of other places were calling themselves the Western Conservatory of Music. The one in Kansas City, there was one in Kansas. There was one in St. Louis I really want to find out about, because it turns out this guy was a charlatan and he stole people's money and left his wife and went to Oregon. Like, it's this whole story that I haven't uncovered on him because it's a whole nother, hole to go down into. But they're everywhere. So trying to discern which one was Scott's and which ones weren't sometimes can be a little bit difficult, but I'm still trying to plot. Right now, a lot of them in Kansas and Nebraska. That was a main area for the expansion of the Western Conservatory, especially in the early part of the 1900s. In 1925, Homer Scott became ill. He moved back to Rolla and moved in with his brother and his wife. And on May 3rd, 1925, Scott died. And with it was the Western Conservatory. After he was gone, there was nobody else to carry it on. I have found no evidence that he even continued in the next fall. And that would make sense. There's really nobody to carry on what he was doing. But again, the legacy still lived on in the music that was being done here in Rolla through his brother, John, that again was the face of music throughout pretty much all the early part of the 20th century. Even the Scott name is still around Rolla, although I heard Scott's Printing did finally close down. Is that no? That's gone. As I say, that one's gone, right? So the last time I did this kind of presentation, I was able to say, well, Scott's is still here. The printing company, they just closed down. I remember growing up, the Scott's Hallmark store over, I think it was over at the Forum, if I'm not mistaken. The Scott name was still here up until literally a couple months ago. So yeah, that is my presentation on the Western Conservatory, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. But yeah, my assumption would be that once the main office shut down, which again, I haven't seen any evidence after Scott dies that it continued. So right now, my assumption is it died as well. I would presume that the teachers probably still, because you're still teaching, you still know how to teach music, even if you still have the materials for the most part. So I could definitely see that at least those teachers would continue on and teach, even if they're not teaching the official Western Conservatory interstate music system kind of curriculum. So that'd be my assumption, but I got to do a little more digging on that. Yeah, and the connection to the Methodist Church continued because obviously John was, and the whole family, they were Methodist. They even the things that I read about John Scott, I mean, like singing in the choir at church and directing this and doing this, and the involvement, John's level of involvement here in Rolla, where, even before, like he started the band that I now direct. 1927 was when the School of Mine started its ROTC band. And so that's actually one of the things I'm looking forward to is celebrating the 100th anniversary of our band coming up in a couple of years. And so I'm actually working on hopefully trying to find a composer to write a commemorative piece for us to play for that. So we did something similar this past spring, a delayed 150th anniversary for the university. It was a little delayed because of COVID, but we did premiere a piece this past spring. I want to do the same kind of thing for the band's 100th anniversary as well. But he was doing music at the School of Mines before that even started. And, they needed some musicians to do a musical or a play. He would provide it, or teachers meetings, like they would have like district teachers meetings here in Rolla or down in Houston or something like that, and he would help provide music for that. I mean, I don't know where he found the time, quite honestly. It was a lot. So, but yeah, and it all started with his family, obviously, and the influence that surely his dad and Ephraim gave him, but then also what he learned at the conservatory and continued on even as a pharmacist. He was still, and that's kind of the example I try to give my students that here at the university. It's like, you're going to leave here and go be an engineer, but you're still a musician. There's still a town band out there. There's still something you can be involved in beyond here. So, and John Scott's a good example of that, definitely. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.